I'm going to do a session about claims-based authentication in SharePoint 2010. Maybe first a show of hands. Who has already configured or worked with claim-based authentication in SharePoint 2010? Not that many. Okay. Who's doing SharePoint development? SharePoint 2010 development? Yeah, okay. So my name is Joris Poemans. I'm the unit manager for Enterprise Content Management Unit at Riel Dommen, where I've been doing SharePoint for about 10 years now. Also SharePoint Server MVP for about 5 years. I have a blog where not so regularly anymore. I post some stuff about SharePoint, Windows Phone, combination of development and IT pro stuff. I also will be posting some updates and links afterwards on my blog. Also the code samples on Windows Live, SkyDrive. So the guys from AvePoint, they have a suite for administering and managing and monitoring SharePoint, both 2007 and 2010. They also announced, I think, beginning of this week, that we will be offering a product for moving SharePoint on-premise to Office 365, given the discussion about Office 365 a little bit earlier. So this is the agenda. First, a little introduction to claims. What is it exactly? And why do we actually need to care? Then how does claims work in SharePoint 2010? I'm not going to talk a lot about how to configure it. Just going to show some samples and some references and what you have to watch out for. And then we're going to look at what you as a developer have to do if you want to access claims information or if you want to use actually the new claims features in SharePoint 2010. Last one is about trusted identity providers. It's basically when your claims security token service of SharePoint is going to talk to some other identity provider, being Facebook, Gmail, an external Shibboleth server, maybe something which is driven by OpenID or something else. There's not a lot of information about that. Posted in some links, especially if you have to work with OpenID. You might take a look at those links. It's still quite new stuff. So identity versus claims. Identity is basically a set of attributes that you use to describe a user, and a claim are those different attributes. If you hear a lot about, if you know about SAML, and SAML they actually call it attributes. Why do they call it claims here? It's because you have to provide a certain value to it. For example, you can log on to your SharePoint, or you can make it work, that you log on to your SharePoint environment using Windows Live ID. And on Windows Live ID, you can have different attributes of your person, your name, but you can also log in, for example, with your Active Directory account. So both will have, for example, the attribute name. So which one are you going to trust? And that's what claims is about. Which of the attributes you're going to trust from a certain identity provider. And how you're going to use those attributes to actually authorize people to do certain stuff. So how does it work? On a very high level, when a user needs to log in, he has to provide a token. A token is an encrypted format where you have a signature of your information that you submit about your user. And this can be something very simple, like just the user ID. But this can be basically any information that you want, you can add into your token. So it can be a name, age, location. You could, for example, build a SharePoint site where you would log in and where you would need to provide, for example, age because you're providing certain type of information. This is just for reference in here. You can look at the slides afterwards. They will be uploaded to Community Day site, just because some of the terms will be coming back and forth during these sessions. Something important as well, the way that Microsoft has built it is that they actually built on top of a number of existing standards. It's not that important that you know how the standards work. This is important that you know, for example, which standards that they abide. And there's a lot of discussion for the moment about SAML 2.0. So basically, in SharePoint for the moment, it's built to actually work with SAML tokens 1.1. So we have to do some transformations and some mapping to actually get it to work on SAML 2.0. Why do we need to care? Or why did Microsoft actually implement claims in SharePoint 2010? One of the first things is that it actually decouples SharePoint of the authentication provider, so that in SharePoint 2007 it was a little bit more tricky if you needed to log in with something else than just Windows authentication. Now they're going to separate the way that you authenticate against an identity provider and the way that you use that authentication information in SharePoint. Your applications, being web parts, application pages, can also decide which claims they are going to trust from which provider. And for example, if you log into SharePoint with, for example, Windows Live, and you can use certain attributes from that Windows Live, but use other attributes, for example, from your internal CRM system, and use that to decide about which information to show and which information not to show. It's also possible to use now multiple authentication providers on one URL. So in 2007, we basically created one web application, extended it again, and mapped it on the same content database, and then you would have on each of the different web applications, you would have one authentication provider. So for example, Windows authentication and form-based authentication on the other one. Now you can do it on one. So we'll see a little bit later that you're first shown a little login screen where you're going to decide which authentication provider you're going to use. If you, for your internal users, want to make it a little bit easier, there's a way that you can use, for example, PowerShell to actually go through that screen and let your internal users just log in with Windows authentication by using, for example, a certain IP range. There's an interesting blog post about that from guys from Orbit One. We'll post it on my blog a little bit later. Another one is about passing off your identity when you logged into SharePoint to external applications. For example, you go to SharePoint, you see a web part. The web part needs to give information back from backend SQL database or from backend CRM system or an ERP system. This is a typical problem that you have with web environments, is that you have double hop issues. So your token first time, user logs in, that's the first hop, and then the second hop is when the server needs to go to the external system. If you don't have Kerberos enabled, you will not be able to pass on your Windows identity through. So if you need to log into the backend system, you need something like either Kerberos or claims. And the last one is about enabling federated identity. So for example, if there are two companies and they work quite a lot together, then you can allow the users of company A to log in with their own Active Directory, and then use ADFS to actually let users from company B log in onto the same system, but with their own Active Directory credentials. Now, claims in SharePoint 2010. First, going to show you how the login experience looks. Close this one. It's not that difficult to configure. It's just you have to make some adaptations to a number of web configs, and you have to change some settings in central admin. I'll show you a little bit later. This is still logged in. If I closed all my windows. Oh, come on. First I'm going to log out. Okay. So when you first log in on a web application, certain web application with multiple authentication configured, we'll see a screen like this. This is a simple one where we just have Windows authentication and Forms authentication, and the FBA scenario that we had in the first version in 2007. So this is just basic. I'm logged on. I use my current users. Or I can use this one. This is basic scenario with ASP.NET membership provider behind it. So my user ID and credentials are stored in a backend SQL database. From a plumbing or a developer's perspective, there's not a lot of changes here. Just need to go for my password. So that's the experience that you get. The other part that you have is just to show you that it actually uses claims. I have a little web art on here, which I'm going to add. It's called the claims list web art. I'll show you the code a little bit later, just to show. So this is what happens if you log into claims, and this is retrieving my iClaims identity, and it's just displaying all the different claims that I have. So I have my claim type. This is either a string or this can be a date time. This can be different things. This is the original issuer. So this is my internal SharePoint. So it's the SharePoint STS which is providing this. And the SharePoint STS is going to another system to retrieve those claims. And so I have my SharePoint Forms SQL member provider. So that's the backend SQL database from where my login comes. And then you notice something different here. SharePoint claim provider, basketball team provider. That's another custom claims provider which is plugged in between and which adds extra information on top of just the username and the password. And you can actually use all those different claims to do things in SharePoint, to secure basically every object that you just secure with Windows Authentication. Just going to log out with the other user, just to show you that the claims are a little different if you log in with Windows Authentication. I have different providers here. I have different information which are coming back. So my original issuer is here Windows. So I'm just using a local Active Directory. It's stored on here. Something important to also know is this one. If you have legacy applications or if you have applications that you wrote in SharePoint 2007, you need to migrate them. You have to be a little bit careful because your SP user object, the way that the login looks, is a little bit different. So you have to kind of rewrite that one. I have a slide which explains what the 0 and all the stuff means, just for reference. So you can have also, for example, you can customize the screen. And you have like nice looking logos that you log on onto Windows Live or on Google or any other system. And then the difference in the two web parts, depending if you log on with a Windows claim or with an FBA or SQL claim. So how this is actually quite simple to get the claims information. So you look at your user object and you use the iClaims principal interface to get into information and just bind on it. Important, you have to first add a reference to the Microsoft Identity Model, DLL. The version you have to use is 3.5. If you have been playing around with the betas, it can be that you have some leftover Geneva identity model DLLs, and then you're basically set to go. About the encoded ID, and this is how it actually looks. It's either going to say this is a normal claim or an identity claim, and there's the I versus the C. And then you have the different claim types that you're getting. And also you see immediately in the encoded ID, which is the original issuer. And this can be Windows, it can be the membership provider or role provider. That's basically ASP.NET. This can be a trusted security token service, something else. This can be a personal card, like a Digi card or something else that you use to log on. Or this can be a local STS claim. So in SharePoint 2010, you basically have two modes. If you install it out of the box, it is classic. So that's basically in there for legacy reasons, because you don't want to shift immediately to claims, maybe. And then on the claim side, underneath, you can have different ways that you can authenticate. You can authenticate just against your Windows identity in the same way as you do to your classic. The only thing is that you're using claims as a kind of a front end. You can use FBA to log on to a SQL Server, an LDAP, to Oracle, to basically whatever you're used to. So if you had a 2007 environment and you're using FBA to log in, you have to switch to claims anyway. The good news is that it's quite easy to do the migration. You just have to modify the 3 web configs, and during when you change the settings, the users will be migrated for you. You can also use SAML or ADFS to go to an external identity provider or to federate off your identity to an external organization. All of those things are converted or actually using a SAML 1.1 token, and that's just converted to the SP user. So the SP user object, from there onwards, everything downwards, and so when you want to access information about that, that's just the same way that you did in SharePoint 2007. There's not a lot of difference there. Two important scenarios, incoming claims. To explain it quite easily, just you need to log on to SharePoint and need some information, incoming claims. Outgoing claims is you're already logged into SharePoint and you want to retrieve information from another system. Either using business connectivity services or using Excel services or reporting services or your own custom code. That's what we call outgoing claims. So how do incoming claims work? Just going to show it with the scenario. And so the first step is that you get the login screen, and that's where you're going to authenticate against your identity provider. This can be a local identity provider like Active Directory, or this can be an external identity provider like Windows Live. That one is going to pass off a token. Then the token is actually used by the SharePoint STS provider, which has a trust relation. For example, if you want to use that with Windows Live, there's a whole TechNet article which explains how to configure Windows Live together with SharePoint 2010. It's quite an extensive one. And to be honest, I actually didn't get to work. I wanted to do demo it, but I missed somewhere something with a trusted certificate. The token is actually then using Windows Identity Foundation. And so for some of you who've worked with the betas, it was called at that moment Geneva. And then it's just using the WSS or SharePoint authorization model. So it's checking, okay, which is the claim you're actually using, what's the user which is logged in, and then it's going to use that information to actually authenticate you and give you authorization to do certain stuff. You notice that little block in the right top-hand corner, the claims providers? That's like the thing that you can put in between if you're an identity provider to augment your claims with extra information. And this can be extra information from an external system or CRM, or this can be your own custom code, which is going to examine the entity that you're getting back, and the login actually, and it's going to add in extra information, and that extra information you're going to use to actually allow people to have access on a certain site or a certain document or a certain list. Important, there's also support for Office applications. This was a little tricky situation in 2007. Where sometimes it worked and sometimes it doesn't work. It was a little complicated. Now they actually described when it's going to work and when not. The thing which is a little bit awkward is it actually depends on the operating system. So you need Windows Vista Service Pack 2 or Windows 7. So everything up there, and also Internet Explorer or higher, 8. So all the claims that you're getting in, you can actually use to give people access. So the people picker that you use to give people access to a certain object is also a little different when you enable claims in central admin. We'll see a little bit later. If you want to access that information from the claims through code, you have to use the iClaims identity interface, like I did in the claims web part I showed a little bit earlier. You can then, SharePoint will do all the magic for you. So when you secure a certain site with a certain claim and the user does not have that claim, or the logged in user does not have the claim, then you would simply don't see it. If you want to use that in code, you can again use the iClaims identity interface and code against it. Show you a little bit in a little code snippet how that works. So just go to site permissions. You see, for example, grant permissions. Here the paper picker. You notice that it's a little different. And so you have the organization, all users, and then you have, for example, the basketball teams example. This is the example that you also find on TechNet. So if you want to try to rebuild this one, everything I show you, just go to TechNet and walk through that example. I will post the working version on my blog as well. So basically, you can, for example, put in your own logic in here and to build or extend the people picker by adding extra information also in the claims provider when you build a custom claims provider. So what I've actually done is when a user logs in for the FBA users, so the user 1 to 15 get as a favorite basketball team wingtips, and user with in the login 15 till 30, they get another login. They get another basketball team. Ah, come on. This game stands still. Yeah, but there's also wingtips normally, because I already added it. I have here one. This is, for example, such a claim that I'm actually using. So all the users which have as favorite basketball team consolidated messenger, they're getting full control. I have here this one as well. Should work. It's probably something in my backend code. So this way you can just basically use every attribute or every claim you can use to do security. And this is something very, very strong or very important that you can use. What you typically do is that you have some batch program which is looking at some external system and then it's creating Active Directory groups for you, or which is creating SharePoint groups for you. Now you can just use the custom claims provider and just go directly to that system and add that as a claim on top of the user, without having to create first the groups and adding the users into them, either in Active Directory or in SharePoint groups. So it's a very powerful way of handling security and handling authorization. So I'm going to log in with one of my users. I have here a little web art. I'm going to just go and close that out one. My token is quite interesting. So what is it doing? It's actually looking at the attribute my favorite basketball team for user 1, and it's going to show that I get a discount if I log in with a user who has that favorite basketball team. And if the user does not have that attribute, I'm not going to show that information. So I'm basically going to use one of my security attributes in my logic of my custom web art. So if I log in with user 16, says no discounts available. Just going to show you the code. I'm not logged in as an administrator. It's actually best practice that if you do some of the development, that you actually test it with a non-administrator user. Even when you, like me, you're working everything in VMware. Nothing too fancy here, it's just a plain web art that I had. The same thing what I did before. This is a little bit visible from the back, or I need to make it a little bit higher, bigger. It's okay? Okay. So I'm using the iClaims principal interface again to get at my claims. And then I'm actually using a link query to check for the existence of a certain claim type. The claim type being schema Steve local.teams. So that's my claim value type. So if you're adding your own claims in a custom claims provider, you have to provide like a unique URL for that, a unique identifier. And if my club claim equals consolidated messenger, I'm going to write out that stuff. Otherwise, I'm just writing out no discount available. So this way you can put in your own logic based on the attributes or based on the claims that you're getting in from your backend system. Again, for reference, this is another one. It's against a project management system. It's from another project. So for outgoing claims then, if you have configured your SharePoint to use claims, your code can use that claim to go to the backend system. Of course, your backend system has to be claims aware. And unfortunately, there's one big exception for the moment, and that's SQL 2008, or even 2005 and everything beforehand, which is not claims aware. So there is a little workaround needed for. The good news is that the next version, the Denali, will be claims aware. So what are scenarios? This is your web front-end code, either your custom code, application pages, web parts, which goes to external VCF services or web services and needs to pass on identity. It's business connectivity services. So a business connectivity service can also use those claims to go to backend systems. Or, for example, in most of the business intelligence scenarios, where you're using Excel services or reporting services to get information from backend systems. Again, the same way of working. The key working part here is the SharePoint security token service. You have to make sure that everything is healthy with that one. So even for developers, just go once in a while, go to central admin, check your health logs to see if there are no issues with that one. The thing is, for example, with the SQL Server, there's a specific service which is actually used to work around the problem with claims and SQL Server, especially if you need to do reporting, like reporting services. If you run reporting services in integrated mode, and SQL Server 2008 Era 2 is actually using this service. So it's a local service which runs on your server. If you look at your Windows, at your SharePoint server, it's also disabled by default. So you have to enable that one and you have to assign it the correct identity. And what's also very important is that's dependent on the crypto service. So what I've seen a number of times is when you did the reboot of a server, that the crypto service was not first online, and then your claims to Windows token service converter did not work. So you have to you have to take a look at that knowledge base article and then configure it that you're always sure that the crypto service is first started before that claims to Windows token service is started. There's a whole white paper about that, how you're going to use that to do integrated logins to non-claims aware scenario, non-claims aware systems when you're using claims in SharePoint 2010. This is the most typical scenario where you're going to use claims. We've done quite a number of SharePoint implementations so far, and the only part that customers are still quite hesitant to say, okay, let's fully go claims. I kind of understand them. If you're just using plain Windows authentication and it works, and then it's okay. If you already did your investment in Kerberos, don't switch to claims just for the sake of trying to use claims. But this is a very typical scenario where you do see it quite a lot when users need to log into another system like a SQL database or an Oracle database where they have their logins. And that's what we did in 2007 with form-based authentication. That's where you do need to have claims present. You can just use either the out-of-the-box providers, the ASP.NET membership provider and role provider. It's the same ones that we have already seen since ASP.NET 2.0, so they're going quite a way back. You have to go to central admin, and then there you can configure to use actually to use that specific claims provider. You have to provide the identities, and then you have to provide the extra configuration details in the web.configs. So if you do the setup first, you can also do that if you did the first complete setup, and then you would need to convert to claims afterwards. You can't do that through the UI, so you have to do that through PowerShell. Some of those little things in SharePoint which might change with Service Pack 1. If you upgrade an FBA web application, so if you add a SharePoint 2007 web application and you do an upgrade, so you do, for example, a content database attached and do an upgrade like that, you still have to manually update the web.configs. You have to do that still manually, but during the configuration of the FBA claims or the claims in central admin, it will do the migration for you. You can still do it, or you can also do it manually, just using STS ADM, the same way that you did beforehand in 2007. This is quite important. There are actually 3 web.configs that you have to change. And the bad news about it is that there's not really a good code solution to do the updates, because the SP web config modification class is not that stable, still not. And there's one web config, the one used by STS, which has a different format and which is not actually using which you can't use with the SP web config modification class. So you first have to do it for a central admin, because you have to make a reference for the people picker. Then in the security token service, and that's it's a little bit looking for it where that is. That's probably somewhere in a nice folder with a GUID in it. If you used the farm configuration wizard. And there's another thing. There's something in 2020 which makes it a little bit easier for a non-IT pro guy to just do a setup. It's just say, okay, typical farm next config WAP. What happens then is that all your database will have those nice little GUIDs in them, and all your service will have those nice little GUIDs in them. So it's a little tricky to find that one. So you look for the STS web config one and update that one. And then, of course, for the web application that you're actually using. This example looks kind of the same as in the previous one. It's not that lot difference. The only difference is that you have to do it now in 3 places instead of 1. So that's not really a way forward in 2010. This is the normal one, the LDAP membership provider. If you want to, for example, authenticate against a novel or a Sun1 or something else, then plain Active Directory. As I said, you can also use just PowerShell to do the conversion. You actually need to use PowerShell if you want to update it for a web application that you first created in Classics mode. Another very important thing, once you switch from Classic to Claims, you cannot not go back. So think about it. This is not something that, let's try this out and then we'll go back. No, fortunately, no. Some development tasks with Claims authentication. Besides just building the web part or using claims to conditionally show information. So the main thing that you're actually going to do is creating custom claims providers. Very important, a custom claims provider has nothing to do with authentication. If you want to build like a complete separate authentication mechanism, you have to do it using Windows Identity Foundation, and don't do it in here. This is actually for 2 things. For claims augmentation, it's by adding your extra claims in there from a backend system. And for making sure that you can actually pick those claims within the people picker. So if you build a custom claims provider, you're always going to do those 2 tools together. If you want to do that, this is for the claims augmentation, adding extra claims which you're going to use. So this is the namespace you're going to use, Microsoft SharePoint Administration Claims, and on the SP Claims Provider class. And then there's a method you need to implement fill claims for entity. So you're basically getting in the entity itself, and there you're going to expect, okay, which is the user, the basic user ID, and then you're going to add extra claims by doing a create claim and adding that in. It's a very good article about that. If you walk that through, it's quite simple. Claims picker, that's for making the people picker a little bit different. This, the the fill hierarchy is the class that you use to, on the left-hand side, use that hierarchy. The fill resolve, you always have to implement that, and the fill search is something where probably is something wrong with my code. If you want to deploy that, you have to use the SP claims provider feature receiver class. There's not really another way to do that. The good thing is that you can nicely package off in one SharePoint solution, hand it over to your system administrator, and then he can just go ahead, so you don't need to provide extra PowerShell. It's just one big package. I'm going to close this one. So this is the SQL claims provider. The name is not that good chosen because it's not actually using SQL. So it's inheriting from the SP claims provider class. And this is where I'm going to fill my claims. So I'm getting my entity back. That's the user which logged in. And I'm just going to parse that one out. And if in my username, user was 1 to 15, I added in these extra information. So just use the claims.add method, and then use the create claim to create your own claims. And this is quite simple logic. And here you could go to a CRM system, or you could go to your SQL database, or to some other custom logic to add in extra information about that user. Here the same one for the fill hierarchy. I just get my hierarchy object back from within my parameters, and I can add in my own labels and my own values. So it's possible to have multiple custom claims providers in between. You have coming information from a SQL database, another one from an ERP system, another one from a CRM system, all which are providing extra information to augment the information about your user. We're using this, for example, to allow login on a SharePoint site, which is used by a non-profit organization, and they're managing all their members and all the responsibles for different regions and different cities within an Oracle database. We're using actually that information to give back the role of a user. He's a voorzitter, he's a secretaris, he's something else, and he's responsible for a certain region. And this way we're going to assign to a site, for example, everybody who is a voorzitter and who is from Antwerp has access to that site, without us having to first create a full SharePoint group structure again by doing a double sync. This way, and other ways you would have a sync mechanism, it wouldn't be up to date. Here you're just going directly to the backend system, and you know immediately that your security information is also up to date. So the fill claims for entity method, first get back your context. You need that to actually get to the page. You get your current user. There again, the encoded ID thing, and just make sure that you do it like that. And you get an empty list wherein you're going to add your own new claims. This is once per session. This means if a user, like I had the problem with the other one, if a user is not logged off, when he has another browser open, another browser session open, then you're not getting that information back. So you have to sometimes do close all your browser windows when you're doing development and debugging. If it's a domain user, it looks like that. If it's a form-based user, like in my example, it looks like the other one. Also be sure to inspect your entity, because your code can be running on a web application where you have multiple claims providers present, or multiple authentication methods. So you have to make sure that it works when the user logs in just with Windows authentication, or even with FBA or something new. Or that it doesn't break when they, for example, have the the new idea that they need something else like Windows Live or Shibboleth or maybe something even more obscure. Just for reference, first the claim type, and that's the URL thingy that you pass in. Then the value, and here I'm just using a string, and the value type. Claim value types you can use. This is the type information that you can pass in an attribute or in a claim. It can be a string, a date, boolean, or a base 64 encoded string. It's not possible to like embed a complex structure in there. This makes it sometimes a little tricky if you need to like do security based on a matrix, where you have, if the user has this role and it's from this region and from this, and you need to pull that into a structure, then it's not really going to work yet. That's unfortunately a little problem. Then trusted identity providers. The first one, but here quite a lot, is, for example, Active Directory Federation Services. This is a separate download that you just install on, download there, and it's just installed on a Windows server. What it's basically going to do is it's going to allow your SharePoint token security token service to talk to a SharePoint security token service in another part somewhere. This can be in another organization. This can be, for example, in the cloud. And this, for example, if you're going to use Office 365 and you need to have a transparent single sign-on in Office 365, you will need to do an install of ADFS 2.0 on-premise. This is a little bit of a hassle, and something why I hope that Microsoft will do something about it. The other thing about this with ADFS, since this is a critical part that needs to work, if you need to have it like highly available, you need to put in 2 servers immediately just to have the single sign-ons experience with the cloud. The other one is Windows Live, and this is the example that you also have in Office 365 itself. And so in Office 365, you just log in with a Windows Live ID by default. You can also have the same mechanism applied to your on-premise SharePoint 2010. Basically, what you're doing to do is you're going to set up a trust relationship between Windows Live service security token service and your internal SharePoint security token service. You're going to specify your redirect URL afterwards. After that, you log on to Windows Live. Where do you have to go back? And then basically you're set to go. Sounds simple, but it's quite a lot of steps that you need to follow to actually get it working. But it's quite extensive described. And I guess it's also quite extensively tested, since they're actually using it themselves for Office 365. This is a question which I got when doing a similar presentation about 2 or 3 times. Is what about OpenID? Yeah. The thing is that there is not an out-of-the-box solution for OpenID, if you need to use that as a third-party identity provider. So you need to transform the claims which are coming back from an OpenID identity provider like Ping, for example, and then transform that so that SharePoint can actually understand it. This is just code using the Windows Identity Foundation classes. There's some code samples on these 2 blocks that you can take a look at. Or you can use another OpenID provider in between. Or you can do, for example, ADFS, and put ADFS 2.0 in between, which does the claims transformation for you. So if you don't need to want to write the code, and you have already ADFS in place, you can use that one to do the claims transformation. So claims are a very powerful way for you to authenticate, and you can write quite interesting scenarios around it. It's also the way forward. So it's quite typical that Microsoft calls their normal authentication method classic. So there's a little point here at that they're actually saying, yeah, this is just for legacy reasons. So I expect with the next version, SharePoint 14, that they will just go claims all the way, that you don't see any classic mode anymore. It allows you for new scenarios of doing authentication and authorization, and also allows you to get rid of all those different sync programs that you're using to create SharePoint groups or Active Directory groups and do the population and do all the follow-up of those things, by just directly connecting your login security system with the backend system using the claims. Additional resources. It's very good reading material, especially on TechNet. Claims is a little bit more of a IT pro stuff thingy, but as a developer you have to know about it, and just to don't fall into surprises that your code has a different SP user object, or that you get different information if you're requesting information. And also that you as a developer know how to set this up. Because I'm not expecting IT pro guys to set up your development environment for you. So if you encounter something like this, you have to know how to set this up.